This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
'17 is coming to an end, and we here at Journeys, Chronicles of Our Asian Century, will be doing a weekly wrap-up of the different aspects of our Philippine foreign policy, the new independent foreign policy, and what it has reaped for the nation. And this week we have a focus on economics, and finance in relation to this foreign policy, and pivot to China of President Duterte. Mr. George C., I think chair, but he says director only of IDSI, the Integrated Development Studies Institute, one of the new and still few, but very vital institutions dedicated to research and studies of Philippine, China, and Asian global issues. So let me say hello first to George.
Good morning, Herman. Very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us. We have a lot of interesting topics in the last...
I recall, of course, you were my guest on the second show in 2016 of Journeys.
And so much has happened since then.
A lot of successes for both China, the Philippines, ASEAN, Asia in this world, in this 21st century. We'll start with news and views for this week, and there are a lot of good news. First of all, let's start this. China cuts import tariffs on almost 200 consumer goods items. China is cutting import tariffs on 187 consumer goods from whiskey to cashmere clothing to help spur spending and economic growth. The Finance Ministry said tariffs will drop from an average of 17.3% to 7.7% on products, including pharmaceuticals, food, health supplements, and clothing. The cut will take effect from the beginning of December. The move is designed to encourage consumers to spend more at home rather than on trips overseas. This is an ongoing process. The report says it is a shift towards creating a consumption-driven economy and signaling to the world, especially the U.S., that it is opening up its economy. Domestically, there is increasing demand for foreign brands, especially after a number of food safety scandals domestically. Doug Lippold, a chief trade economist at the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, said the cuts in the import tariffs are positive and part of an ongoing process by the government. And I'll ask for some comments from our business man and business leader with the Federation of Philippine Chamber of Commerce.
Actually, this cut in tariffs is a huge cut because it's from an average of 17.5%. They cut it to 7%. But we still have to be the ones to look for the enterprises, products, and services we're going to be providing. We have to be much more entrepreneurial and active. We are just one of the closest neighbors, and they're giving us all the allowances and support, and we really have to take up, in the end, we have to take the challenge.
Yes. This is, of course, partly an action to help the U.S. adjust to the new global economic order. But we will be benefiting on the sidelights
because aside from this,
will open up.
Aside from this, China has started and closed a couple of free trade agreements, including with Australia, and the RCEP is proceeding forward very strongly. And there's in fact free trade agreement being negotiated between Japan, Korea, and South Korea and China. And the RCEP, we are going to all be beneficiaries, but again, we have to put ourselves in the flow of things.
The RCEP is the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership.
Yes, which took over from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, very funnily called Trans-Pacific, and then excluded China.
That's right. Well,
and which the U.S. in the end, after getting everyone on board against China, and then they backed out of it.
yes, yes, and leaving Vietnam, Japan in mid-air. But I think Vietnam has made a very fundamental decision to shift back to China now with the new agreements with China and so on.
Yes, they have been very strongly courting China, even during the time when there was these riots against the factories. Within 2 months, was it the president or prime minister brought 200 of the top businessmen to ask for investments in China. That's one of these practical approaches, one of the reasons why, say for instance, in just the garments industry alone, the Philippines at its peak was exporting $3.2 billion of garments. And now after a few years, Vietnam is exported last year $30 billion worth of garments.
Okay, despite not having the TPP, they will sustain it.
Yes.
Okay. And my question now, two things. One, how's the Federation going to help Filipino entrepreneurs with this China market? Number two, maybe IDC, the Integrated Development Studies Institute, can help guide the Filipino entrepreneurs with more information about the China market. We know, of course, China is opened up for fruits and other foodstuffs. Tourism will be rising, targeting 1 million. What else?
Yes, a lot of it is not very visible because they're not infrastructure or big ticket items, but very important. So, for instance, we're looking at China for investments, for loans. They're doing a lot of enablers. No? The Federation has been discussing with some of the officials with China. For instance, we went to Alibaba and they said they're going to create training programs for the Philippines and ASEAN. So, in fact, they gave the very first trial training program to the Federation members about 5 or 6 months ago. And now they've announced that they're going to give it to Southeast Asia. They announced it in Singapore. And they're not only teaching us about how to do business on the internet and digital cell phone with China, they were actually teaching us how to use Amazon, how to use eBay. So they're trying to expand the entire market.
Yeah. This is an impromptu question. Just rose came into my mind that the Philippines is a coconut products exporter. And one of our a friend's brand was stricken off Alibaba because of nuisance cases filed by, consumers in China, fake consumers. They try to make money from, harassing listed products there. And so, is the Federation in a position to help in cases like this?
Well, there's no official position to help, but maybe if we had some details,
So,
we could bring it up in some way.
Maybe I'm asking is if the Federation has some formal arrangement with the Chinese government and to help in these problems, for example, of our exporters to China.
There is no formal arrangement, but in many cases they have been able to help before. There are also cases in which they have not been able to help.
Okay.
So there were cases of Philippine businesses in China, and there were cases of Chinese fishermen or businessmen in the Philippines. So there is a channel open, but there's no formal structured approach, so we don't know.
Okay. Well, I think we'll be faced with more of these practical questions and problems as the months go by, and in this 2018, if we try to increase trade with China.
Actually, that's one of these things that you, Herman, and our institute, we have also our links with the embassies, because they have put up, or they said that they're putting up some kind of communication line so that issues on business, they have been addressing issues on business.
So we'll follow up on that in the future episodes that we have. Now, the second news item we have is up to the U.S. to make it a good news. But anyway, the latest North Korean ICBM can hit Washington, D.C. and much of the rest of the U.S. And we draw most of our report from CNBC's report. The intercontinental ballistic missile launched by North Korea on November 28 has the power to reach Washington, D.C. and much of the rest of the United States, experts said. In contrast, Pyongyang's earlier ICBM test in late July was believed to be capable of hitting a bit more than half of the continental US, but not Washington. The latest ICBM fired during the middle of the night in North Korea soared as high as 4,500 kilometers above Earth and landed nearly 1,000 kilometers from its launch site, falling into the Sea of Japan. During the 50-minute test, the missile went higher, frankly, than any previous shot they've taken, said Defense Secretary James Mattis. If the missile had flown on a standard trajectory rather than Tuesday's lofted trajectory, it would have a range of more than 13,000 kilometers, according to David Wright, co-director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, a non-profit advocacy group. Quoting them, such a missile would have more than enough range to reach Washington, D.C. and in fact any part of the continental United States, Wright said in a note. Okay, there are precedents to this, and let me cite them. The latest Korean missile test comes after 2 months lull, which Russia has expressed encouragement in just a day earlier. But the hope was soon dashed by the North Korean missile test the day later. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov later was reported to say that the provocations by the U.S. seem to show it is interested to egg on North Korea into taking precipitate action. During the lull in North Korea's weapons testing, the U.S. sent to the vicinity of North Korea 3 U.S. aircraft carriers, creating the worst ever situation. And it doesn't help that Trump has been saying in the meantime and calling for Japan to buy U.S. military equipment to protect itself against North Korea, creating the belief that Trump is just doing this to sell more weapons. North Korea has made it clear to the United States and to the world that it's time for the U.S. to negotiate a peace treaty with it, as the North Korean media has been announcing. I think we should show that clip if you're ready with that. You see, and of course, the American media, well, this one was about the 3 U.S. aircraft carrier. Let's forward the images, and this is the military equipment that Trump has been pushing South Korea and Japan to buy, creating the belief that the U.S. is just creating this tension to sell more arms. And then let's move on with the other images. I'm sorry I was too fast. Now the North Korean media has been saying repeatedly it's time for the U.S. to negotiate a peace treaty with Korea. And the next image will show also that the Western press is carrying this. Newsweek carried this news that peace treaty and halt to exercises would end the nuclear tests of North Korea. So why isn't Trump just opening the peace talks with North Korea, which is the position of President Xi Jinping of China?
Actually, there's precedence to this, because in the Middle East, I think in Iraq and Libya, it's the same thing.
That's right.
They were discouraged from taking nuclear tests and developing nuclear weapons. And then when they gave it up, the U.S. invaded and had the leaders executed. So the world has to understand the psychology of this, because the U.S. has a policy of preemptive strikes. No? So someone, possibly the best thing is really to sit down, and when the windows open, they have to take it. If not, we have to assume that the West is trying to provoke them.
I think the Filipino public should press the U.S. Through various means.
Yes.
To sit down and talk peace with North Korea. Okay, our last new item, the Western media, let's move on with our news reports. We're adjusting the prompter for a while, which I wrote anyway too. Anyway, final item, Russia to launch independent internet for BRICS nations, published by the RT, I think. The Russian Security Council has asked the country's government to develop an independent internet infrastructure for BRICS nations, which would continue to work in the event of global internet malfunctions. The initiative was discussed at the October meeting of the Security Council, which is Russia's top consultative body on national security. President Putin personally set a deadline of August 1, 2018 for the completion of the task, the RBC news agency reported. While discussing the issue, members of the Council noted that the increased capabilities of Western nations to conduct offensive operations in informal informational space, as well as the increased readiness to exercise these capabilities, pose a serious threat to Russia's security. They decided that the problem should be addressed by creating a separate backup system of domain name servers, DNS, which would not be subject to control by international organizations. The system would be used by the countries of the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And as a Filipino, I welcome this, to have a separate internet web.
Yes. Actually, I hear that from friends in the community that the EU also wants to have a separate or independent internet management group, but the US is refusing. It wants total control. So when they're talking about hegemony, they really should be examining the idea more closely.
Okay, so there is a lot of good news, as you can see. But hang on, we'll move on to people and places about the Philippines and China and Asia.